I'd like to look with you today at the lessons for diplomacy from the revolutions that took place in the Arab world over the last year. And let me begin by talking about the title of my talk. And I owe part of it to actually Tamer himself. The quotation, "You can crush the flowers, but it won't stop the spring," was actually taken from one of the field hospitals in Tahrir Square. It was written on the wall in one of the November uprisings. So I don't know to whom to attribute this beautiful saying. It was just written anonymously on the wall. And I had originally entitled my talk, "You Can Crush the Flowers, but It Won't Stop the Spring: Arts, Culture, and Media, and the Arab Spring." And in a typo, I think Tamer sent it to me, and it became the Arab Spirit. And I realized that is actually what it's about, so thank you for that. Now, I'd like to begin this discussion with you about the lessons for diplomacy of these revolutions over the last year with my favorite question that was asked around Washington amongst government and policymakers when the Egyptian revolution began a year ago. Why didn't we know about this? Why are we surprised? And specifically, why didn't the CIA know about the revolution? Why didn't we anticipate this? Well, to me, this is completely the wrong question. This is a 20th century men in suits around a table signing treaties version of diplomacy question. These men in suits around a table are signing the Paris Peace Treaty in 1973 that ended the Vietnam War. Not that that was a bad thing, that was a good thing. But as we know, that's not the way diplomacy is run anymore. It's an illusion to think that change comes about from a government to government, authority to authority way. We live in a different world now where so much authority and change comes from the voice of the people. So to look at the world from a prism of government to government, authority to authority, is a very deceptive thing. And from that perspective, Egypt looked very stable. Been the same government for 30 years, played the same role in the perspective of the United States, very valuable role in maintaining stability in the Middle East. But what we've learned is, of course, you have to look below the surface. You have to look in this age of 24/7 journalism, citizen journalism, media going nonstop. You have to look at what the people are saying. And for people like me, for example, who I'm sorry to say don't speak Arabic, the voice of the people is nonetheless accessible. It's accessible through films, music, books, blogs. Take, for example, the Yakubian building. That's the most popular book, most widely distributed book and film of the last decade in Egypt. It's a story written by Ala al-Aswani, who actually has to earn his living as a dentist. Well, not anymore, but until this book. Actually, he may still be doing it. I visited him in his dentist's office at 10 o'clock at night in Cairo. It's a book that chronicles the lives of different people living in one building in Cairo, from the ground floor through some very beautiful, luxurious apartments, all the way up to the roof, which this image shows, where you have the most impoverished people living basically in tents on the roof. And what you see in the film is, we can go ahead with the movie if you can get it going. You see the inequalities in society. And here the person in the suit is going to become the protagonist of the film, and he's actually gotten into a university. But he sits there looking at these very privileged people, and he realizes, even with the education that he's going to be able to have, the fact that he comes from a less advantaged background he's never going to break in. He's never going to get ahead. And so he finds the only place where he can feel respected, feel that he has a role, is in the circle of a particular mosque. And he eventually ends up leading an uprising. This film was made, let me emphasize, in 2008. It was the Egyptian entry to the Academy Awards competition, so it was long before the revolution. But he finds that this is the only place where he has a place in society. And you see through his experience and through the other experiences of the people in the book that no matter how hard they work, no matter how hard each individual works and how well they do in their lives, they can't get anywhere because of the endemic corruption. And there it is, you know, spelled out before you, the problems in Egyptian society. Yakubian building shows it on a macro level. Another film that shows on a more micro level issues in society is Microphone, a story, thank you, of Alexandria. And it's a story of a group of hip-hop artists in Alexandria, and all they want to do is just have a concert. And they are struggling to be able to perform publicly. Why don't we go ahead and do this film? They're struggling to be able to perform.
We visit the local head of the
movie. And
yes.
You hear their music during the film. And I want you to pay attention to the lyrics here.
Yes. يا مان مشروع سين تشيك 1 2 يا الكل واقف ضدي بس انا مش لوحدي الموضوع ده مش هيعدي اعتبره تحدي مش هنحله ودي الاسلوب ده مش هيفيدني هو ده اللي عندي واللي ما بيسمعش يسمعني ناس وناس خلاص مفيش احساس البني ادمين عندنا في مخهم في ترباس كل اللي حوالينا بيجروا بس احنا في دولتنا بنسحب مش بنمدوا مزيكتنا هتغيركم بس شويه منكم سياستنا حته منكم خليها بيني وبينكم وانا عارف مش عاجبكم الحقيقه بتزعلكم بس انا مش جاي انصحكم وافوقكم عشان نمتوا
مؤتمرات حكومات تستغل الانسان بالقوانين مشروع سين مشروع التحمير لاجل التطوير
ديكتاتور
تحصينات أمنية لحماية مسؤولين الدولة دي مظاهرات احتجاجية من فيها ساكن المساكن أغلبية من فيها حاكم أقلية رأسمالية مؤتمرات حكومات
مشروع سين
مشروع التحمير
White crew baby That's right.
Now you find in the lyrics of this song, this rap song, and Microphone was actually scheduled to open in Cairo, if you can believe it, on January 25th, 2011. Needless to say, it never had its opening. In fact, the film hasn't actually been screened that much in Cairo because it missed its opening. Everyone was too busy having a revolution to go to the movies. But it nonetheless does, in those lyrics, you anticipate many of the sentiments that came out in the revolution. You notice at one point they say, you're asleep, we're going to wake you up. And many people in Egypt said they feel as if they are awake for the first time. You know, as you probably know, hip-hop in the Arab world takes its roots originally from political hip-hop in the United States. Often when you talk about hip-hop in the United States, people think about diamonds and teeth and misogyny and all that, but that's not the part of hip-hop that has resonated in other parts of the world. Instead, it's the very political hip-hop, exactly what you see, people outside the center of authority who are protesting the conditions that they live under, and it's found a very important place in the Arab world. So here again in this film, it's the frustration with authority, just trying to do the most simple thing, and everywhere a bribe is required, and then in the end, they can't move forward. And hip-hop then played a very important role in the revolution in Tunisia, where the real voice of the revolution was this artist, El General, and his arrest at the beginning of the revolution, just before it took off, was, I would say, the second most important precipitating factor after, of course, the tragic self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi. But when El General was arrested, then a whole crowd of people came outside the jail, and the government was forced to release him. And if you look at a sample of his lyrics, you'll see that on the one hand, it's very critical, but on the other hand, and this is characteristic of hip-hop as well, there is a real strain of patriotism. There is a kind of vision of, this is the condition we're living under, but it doesn't have to be this way, in a sense of what could be for his country. And he says, I speak in the name of the people, and that is the role that hip-hop music has played. Again, for years, it was there to be seen. And of course, the other very important factor is social media. And after Khaled Said was murdered in Alexandria in June of 2010, when he was removed from the internet cafe where he was just writing and working by Egyptian security police, taken outside, beaten to death, and then brought back and left on the street, Wael Ghanim, we now know, the Google executive, set up the Facebook page in his name, and it attracted, in a very short period of time, 350,000 signatures. What an incredibly powerful message of the sentiment, resentment, frustration, anger at the way people were being treated. And that, of course, all these factors eventually culminate in the extraordinary gathering that began January 25th, 2011 in Cairo and then spread all over Egypt. And when I say that if you looked at these different forms of expression, you might have known that a revolution was possible, I don't mean to say that I or anyone could predict that it would have started when it started, last 18 days, be nonviolent. I mean, no one could predict that. But what you could see, if you looked at the country, these countries, through the eyes of the people, rather than through the prism of security relationships, stability in the Middle East, government to government, then you would know that these countries were pressure cookers. And the surprise is not that the revolutions took place, it surprises that it took so long. Now, I've suggested that you should look at social media. You'll find many governments now, the United States certainly, we have many Facebook pages, from all the embassies have Facebook pages, everybody's tweeting, but it's a two-way street. And I think a problem is that the people in authority who are now embracing social media, they have what I call a little bit the Ashton Kutcher syndrome. You may be familiar with this American movie star, which is many, many tweets going out, but not reading anyone else's. So you have to read what's coming in. And I've just gotten on Twitter, which makes my children just laugh in hysteria. But it's only because I've finally been convinced that it's such an important political vehicle in the Arab world. I mean, one problem is most of the tweets in Arabic and I can't read them, but I can at least sense something's going on at like 10 o'clock when I can see the 10, and I get someone to tell me what it is. But the idea that real political discussions are going on, it happens in the United States too, but I think it happens much more importantly here, and we need to understand that and follow it. So this led to the revolutions that began in January and of course are still going on. This is an image from November of 2011, so it's very much of an ongoing process. And even though this is a picture from the January 2011 revolution, even though in Egypt today the government is certainly not, if anything, is even more repressive than Mubarak, the SCAF, the Supreme Council of Allied Forces, Army, but what has changed is the people. And this, again, is not something that's so obvious if you just look at the government. You have to look at what the people are saying and feeling. And Egyptians will say, even though they haven't changed so much yet in the government, the people have changed irrevocably, and they have banished fear. And now there are new voices emerging, such as, for example, the graffiti artist. This is one of the best known, and you can see him here literally working on the run as he's painting on the street. And very often the images are then whitewashed, covered over by the authorities. And so the answer is artists such as Mofa Ganzir then put their images on T-shirts. And people wear the T-shirts and they spread the word of what they're saying. not just in Egypt, but also in Libya. Graffiti was very important. This is an image that a friend of mine took who was there right after the fighting ended. Now, it's not only young people who are the voice of what people are thinking in these revolutions, but also older musicians. This is a traditional group, the El Tambura group in Cairo, and they performed in Tahrir Square. As you know, there were stages set up, and different musical groups and theatrical groups performed in the original revolution and have come back each time. And the head of El Tambura told me that he was very nervous, in a way, to go into the square with his group, because there's so many people there and the mood could shift very quickly, and he didn't know if, as an older group, if they would be embraced by the crowd or not. This is an image of the crowd as they walked into Tahrir Square. And they, as you can see, were greeted very warmly. They sang songs from the Nasser era. But again, it was about Egypt, about what Egypt could be, these very patriotic songs, and they were indeed very warmly received. So, you know, what I'm trying to suggest is that these creative outlets, including blogs, are mirrors of what people are thinking, and that policymakers should pay attention to them, also the incoming, not just the outgoing, and that these kinds of voices help us understand the texture of these revolutions. Remember, people in Tahrir Square, they weren't carrying signs that said free and fair elections. They were carrying signs that said dignity. That's a very much more complex thing. I'd like to compare what has gone on in the last year in the response to it to the last time that for the United States and on the international stage, culture was a very important part of international relations. And that was the Cold War era, during the time that it was basically the West on one side and the Soviet Union on the other side. And the United States, during that period, devoted a great deal of time, energy, and money to sending American performers abroad. And very important in this effort were the jazz musicians. Jazz, in a way, then was a bit like hip-hop music today. It was the global language of music, embraced everywhere. And its very form kind of embodied freedom and individual expression. But I would say to you that a critical component that made these jazz tours so successful was the fact that these were African American musicians traveling around the world as cultural ambassadors in the 1950s and 60s. And if any of you have seen the film The Help, you have a very clear understanding of what life was like for African Americans in many parts of the United States in that period. They would arrive in other countries in the world and they would be treated extremely well, treated really like almost like royalty. But if anyone asked them what their life was like in the United States, they would say, for example, we're not even allowed in the front door of the theaters where we perform. We're not even allowed in many restaurants. We can't even go in the front door of the hotel. And the very interesting thing that happened was that they were totally honest about this on their tours. There's a famous story, this is Dizzy Gillespie, that he tells that in his autobiography, that when he went to the State Department for a briefing before one of his tours, he said to them, I don't need your briefing. I've lived in this country, I know what this country is, and I'm going to tell people if they ask me. And the great thing is, he was sent anyway, leading these tours around the world. Now, if you are trying to communicate about freedom of expression and promote the value of freedom of expression, well, there is no better way to do that than to enact it. And so these artists traveled around the world and they freely spoke their mind, and others, the people they were visiting, watched in astonishment as not only were they not punished for criticizing the very government that sent them, but they were put back on the plane and sent somewhere else to do it again. In addition, they acted out their democratic principles. So when they would travel, very often they were asked to perform before the leaders of society, the government. They would do that, but they would also insist on being able to give public concerts, on being able to perform before people who couldn't afford to buy tickets, who wouldn't have access. And here you see Louis Armstrong at the Cairo Children's Hospital. So in what they said and what they did, they embodied the democratic principles that they were sent to promote. Well, things were much clearer then in the Cold War period. They were much more black and white. And there was a real harmony and synchrony between the policies of the US government and the values that the people who represented it promoted. That's less true now. It's a much more complicated and much more difficult situation, and everyone has seen, I mean, you can't hide anything anymore. Everyone knows about the inconsistency between the support the United States has given to dictators all over the world, but particularly in the Middle East, and then promoting values of democracy, the inconsistency between the response to different revolutions, the equivocations during the revolutions. So I'd say I put this in direct contrast to Secretary Clinton's recent very strong statements on Syria. But nonetheless, this was true in the past. And so that's led to a questioning, a lack of credibility of the United States. So I'm going to suggest to you that in this era today, the old methodology of sending performers or representatives from the United States to places to promote ideas is not necessarily the most effective way to work. I would say that a more effective way to work is to leverage local voices, to empower local voices. This happens, for example, with the many versions of the American Idol contest that take place around the world. I know if there's anyone from Great Britain here, it started with Britain's Got Talent, but American Idol is better known, just give me that. And one of the places where this has had an incredible impact is in Afghanistan. I hope many of you have seen the great documentary Afghan Star, but it tells the story of the American Idol contest in Afghanistan, where they go all over the country having tryouts every year. This is the first day of tryouts last year in Kabul. Thousands and thousands of people turn up, and not just men, but also women. And it turns out that these American Idol contests are meritocracies. And that is such an important thing. I'm back to the idea in the yakubian building. These are contests where people succeed based on their own inherent talent, not their family connections, not money, not their tribe. And so someone from a different tribe wins every year. It becomes a platform for women. A woman hasn't won yet, but they always make it to the finals. And this is true also in this region, where you have the Poet of the Millions contest, which I think is a fascinating sort of transformation of the American Idol model, where, as you know, I'm sure you know, it is broadcast out of Abu Dhabi, and it's a competition in Nabati poetry, of original poetry. And what has emerged in this contest are these extraordinary female poets. This is Aida al-Jahani, another one is Hissa Hilal, and these women come forward with these very powerful verses. Hissa Hilal in particular criticizes what she calls these arbitrary fatwas. She criticizes religious authorities coming from Saudi Arabia. That's quite an extraordinary thing. And what we've seen in these contests is that winning seems to be a universal value. Sometimes, at least this was true for Aida al-Jahani, her family protested, her family was against her entering. But as she's, not her husband, interestingly, but the rest of her family, as she succeeded more and more, then everyone got behind her. Hissa Hilal, now there's a documentary about her. So these meritocratic contests where it's just people succeeding on their own abilities turns out to be a place of real empowerment. I'm working on a contest now in Egypt that is for Egyptian women to sing and compete that way, but they also are going to speak out on their vision of the role of women in Egypt and also the future of Egypt. And we're going to give them communication and leadership training as well as a way to give voice, give a platform to women in Egypt who have disappeared a bit, I'm afraid, since the revolution. It's a very innovative public-private partnership from the U.S. Embassy. So I'd like to end by emphasizing several things. The importance of listening to the voice of the people and then integrating that into policy making at the highest levels of government. Then I'm suggesting that it's a good idea to change or at least modify the traditional export model of cultural diplomacy, sending people from one place to another, and instead work on empowering local voices. And then finally, in this age of 24/7 communication and media, you have to walk the walk. You have to embody the values you promote. If not, people will see right through you. Thank you very much.